Okay, hello, and thank you for joining us today. My name is Yongki and I'm a senior associate at Scott Legal PC. Today, we are going to talk about E2 visa options for low investment amounts and high risk E2 visa cases. And we are very lucky to have our firm's managing partner, Kelly Weiner, as the speaker for this webinar. I will be covering the beginning parts of our presentation, and Kelly will take over the rest. Before we dive in, let me briefly introduce our firm and go over a few housekeeping items. We are a full-service immigration law firm, and we offer services in a wide range of areas, including E2, O1, TN, L1, H1B, and any types of employment-based or family-based green card cases. That said, we are especially well known for our work with the E2 visas, and we have built a strong reputation in this area, and we have processed hundreds of E2 visa cases. Many of them were higher risk cases and have worked with US consular offices all over the world. One of the reasons why we are focusing on this E2 visa area is that our firm was established on an E2 visa by our firm's founder, Ian Scott himself. And that's why we know a lot about it. And okay, at the end of the webinar, we'll send you several useful tools. A copy of a PowerPoint presentation we'll go through today, and a link where you can download the guides with more details on visa options, a link to sign up for additional webinars, and a link to webinar recording on YouTube. We encourage you to subscribe and hit the notification button as we regularly post immigration-related videos. And lastly, a link where you can set up a private consultation with our team. Finally, for any questions, please type them into chat box or Q&A box. We'll address all the questions at the end of presentation. And with that, let's get started. So what are the E2 visa requirements? E2 visa is basically based on treaty agreement between the United States and a foreign country. And currently, United States have signed agreement with more than 80 countries. The list of E2 countries occasionally change, not often, like every few years. A few countries would be added or fall off from the list. So you should check the official E2 country list before you actually submit your E2 visa application. But keep in mind that you do not need to be born from the treaty country. You just need to hold a passport from the treaty country. So for example, you were born in India, which is not a treaty country with the United States, but later immigrant to the Canada, and you have a Canada passport now, then you are eligible for the E2 case. And you must own at least 50%, half over in the E2 company. The corporation type doesn't matter, but we usually recommend LLC or C Corp because these are the types that giving you very simple and clear supporting documents. You could have a business partner, for example, if you are a Canadian and your business partner who owns the other 50% of the company has an Italian passport, then your business partner can also apply for the E2 visa as well. But you have to make sure that you have at least 50% ownership, and this requirement continues when you try to renew your E2 visa later on. So you should consult with an immigration attorney whenever there is any change of ownership structure in your E2 business. The next requirement is that you must make a substantial investment. Then what is the substantial investment? we'll talk about it more in detail later, but generally speaking, it means sufficient amounts to make the E2 business fully operational. For example, if your business is a consulting company, then obviously the required funds to establish the business are much less than a manufacturing facility. However, can you claim that your consulting company only needs $5,000 to make it fully operational? Not likely. To meet the standard of consular officers and satisfy their review standards, we generally recommend to invest minimum $50,000 regardless of your business type. I'm sure Kelly will address this issue more details later on. For now, let's go over with each bullet point here. Funds must be at risk. It means the wire transferred investment funds must be used and spent. For example, you transferred $100,000 to your E2 business account. Then you need to spend money to obtain lease, to buy necessary equipment, or to obtain professional accounting or marketing services. You will need to show that you have spent sufficient amount out of the total $100,000 investment fund before you submit your E2 visa application. Next one is source of funds should be satisfied. Any legit source can be used, but please keep in mind that government wants to see very clear fund flows from your submitted documentation. So you should try very hard to keep it simple and easy for government officers to understand how funds were originated and came to the E2 business account. How much is enough? Again, we'll talk about it more detail next slide, but generally speaking, we recommend you invest and spend at least $50,000. The typical E2 expenditures, so this bullet point is to show you how you should spend your investment for the purpose of your E2 visa application. You do not want to spend several $100s for a beautiful dinner with a potential business partner and claim it as a business expense for your E2 case. In real life, yes, you could claim it for your company tax deduction purpose, but such is not highly recommended for your E2 case. So keep in mind that inventory, equipment, website, office supplies, office warehouse, rent, marketing, business entity setup, these are the most preferred expenses for your E2 case. Next slide. The next requirement, the business cannot be marginal. This is the whole point of the E2 business, creating, jobs and contributing the local economy in the United States. So that's why E2 visa was created from the United States government, to improve the local economies. So if E2 business is barely making incomes just to cover you as an E2 investor and your family members and living costs, the government would not like it, because that way you are not really contributing anything to the local economy just because you are just surviving yourself. Therefore, it is very important that your E2 business should create enough incomes to hire US employees. You can even hire an employee before you apply for the E2 case. Such would actually strengthen your E2 case. So if you think your investment is low, and it may be a good strategy to hire a US employee before you submit your visa application. Business must be real and operating. What it means is that when you arrive at United States with a valid E2 visa, your business must be able to start operating. To prove this element, you will actually need to submit a signed commercial lease agreement. Business entity has been established, a document proving that your company website has been already created, and maybe sign the contract with the customers, and maybe like licenses if it is required. Next, you will solely develop and direct the E2 enterprise. It simply means you are coming to United States only for your E2 business. Your E2 business is basically your full-time job. So you should not driving Uber as a side hustle or just become a passive shareholder of your E2 business. You should be actively participating in the E2 business's daily operations. But just one practical tip about this element is that when you submit your application to USCIS, they are a little more concerned to see if you are actually performing services without any employees, because such would be direct competition against the local labor market. So if you have been running your E2 business too long without any employees, you should consult with an immigration attorney to carefully develop your applications. Next, you must have intent to return to the home country upon expiration of your E2 visa. The E2 visa is basically not a green card, or it does not automatically lead to a green card. It only allows you to enter United States for temporary period to develop and run your E2 business. But it does not mean you cannot renew your E2 visa or obtain US permanent residency later on. You could renew it, eventually may go after US green card, but you should carefully design your case direction with the immigration attorney for the green card case. The next one is a few options for the starting point. You can start a business or buy an existing business, or you can sign into a franchise agreement. If we are considering to buy an existing business, please consider that a business already has a good number of employees, because again, having existing employees before you submit visa application is really good plus point. Also, you could arrange escrow consideration in the transaction. This is one exception to the requirement where I said you should have spent enough money before applying E2 visa. The contract language in the business transaction will say that the transaction money will be held in the escrow account and will be released upon approval of E2 visa application. But this type of a transaction and contract language has been acceptable by governments. So if you have trying to buy a business, you can insert this type of language in your contracts. Next. So how long is the E2 visa valid? Well, it depends on the treaty agreement between the United States and the foreign country. It could be very short, like 3 months, or 5 years. Then does it mean that I could run my business only for 3 months if visa is only valid 3 months? No. Regardless of the visa validity duration, you will typically get 2 years of E2 status when you come to the United States. So you could run your business for 2 years, but once you go out from the United States, you may have to reapply and renew your E2 visa again if your E2 visa validity is very short. Next. The regulations do not typically state the minimum investment amount. As you know, the EB-5 requires a minimum investment like $800,000, but E2 does not have such a requirement. This means you could get approval even with like $50,000, depending on the type of your business. More importantly, you need to show that the amount is enough to make the business fully operational. And that it looks reasonable to the government officer. So that is why we usually recommend the investing at least $50,000 to meet the government officer's review standard. Sometimes the government applies what is called proportionality test. This usually comes up in a very large investment situation, like $1 million pharmaceutical factory. In that case, you may not need to spend 100% before you apply, because the investment fund is too large that it's pretty much impossible to spend all the money. But since we are talking about smaller and riskier investment cases in this webinar, I would generally say that the proportionality test does not really apply, and it is much better if you spend 100% of investment fund before you submit your E-2 visa application. And if you are buying a business, you may wonder what counts as a substantial amount. Usually it is fair market value. To find out, you may hire a business appraiser and get an evaluation report. Next. So what are some strategies to deal with the low investment amount? If your E-2 case is weak because your investment amount is small, and you may want to strengthen other aspects of your case. So hiring a US worker before you submit the application is probably one of the best steps you can take. Another thing you can do is show that your E-2 business already has demand from potential clients or business partners in the United States. So a signed contract or MOU or letter of intent from potential clients can be very useful. You can also get a letter from local chamber of commerce where your business is located. So such a letter could say that your E-2 business will create jobs and provide value to the community. This kind of support can make a huge difference in low investment case. As you may know, a business plan is one of the required documents. A strong plan shows your marketing, competitive strategies, and projected revenues and how many employees you plan to hire over the next 5 years. That's why when our firm prepares one, it is usually more than 30 pages, and it is designed to strengthen your case and meet the officer's standard. A CPA letter can also used. This type of letter basically will say the accountant reviewed the financials of your business, and based on their experience, the invest amount is sufficient to operate the business. You could be more creative to strengthen a low investment case, but these are the usual typical ways we recommend. With that in mind, let me turn it over to Kelly, who will guide you through the next part of our presentation. She will cover how to wisely spend the money to improve your E-2 visa case and how to overcome common challenges. So please stay tuned.
Thank you, Yongki. So, we've listed here, some common E-2 visa expenditures, as Yongki mentioned in the beginning of the presentation, some things like taking a client out for a nice dinner. These are not going to be strong expenditures. what you want to think about is what is really necessary for your type of business to kind of show that you've invested everything to get it to the point that it could start to operate. So, what we've listed here are some common things that most businesses will need. Things like a website setup and hosting, computers, printers, scanners, iPads, inventory. So, some companies may need inventory, furniture if it's used for business purposes. So, furniture doesn't work if you say, well, I'm going to have a home office and I'm going to work at my dining room table. So, I've bought a dining room table. That's not a good option for the E2. But let's say you have a commercial office space, you have to buy some desks or chairs if they're not provided, or you're doing a video production company and you need to get some things for that, or you're opening a restaurant, those types of things, furniture can be a good expenditure when it's specifically related to the business. Trademark and intellectual property can work. Also, employee payroll or independent contractor payments directly related to setting up the US business are helpful. Legal fees can be included, including legal fees related to kind of filing the case, although those are kind of less strong than ones that are more directly related to corporate setup. Commercial lease, and you can also prepay for some amount of your commercial lease. Again, things like, well, I'm going to have a home office, so what about my rent or my mortgage? Those are not going to work for E2 expenditures. Other things like software, advertising, office supplies, these are just some of the expenditures that you can make. There may be other things that are needed depending on the type of business you're starting. So you always want to think about that as your starting point holistically, like what would this business need to be able to start running? But these are some things that apply to many businesses. And we can go to the next slide. Perfect. So, some weak expenditures, so travel, flights, anything where you're saying, well, I'm coming to the US to investigate the business. These are generally not strong expenditures. If you are coming for a very specific conference or, it's an activity for the business, you may be able to include it, but it's just not very strong. There's even some consulates that will say, like, do not include flights, do not include taxis. They don't want to see those type of expenditures. Um, a car or a vehicle. So this really could go on either list, again, depending on what type of business you're starting. So for most businesses, if you're saying, I need a car to get to and from work, it's not going to be a strong expense. If you have a very specific business, you're running a taxi service, you have a food truck business, you're a mobile groomer, then of course you need, a vehicle. Or sometimes construction companies maybe need a truck, to haul equipment. So if it makes sense and it's specifically going to be used primarily for the business, then a vehicle sometimes can be included, but it's kind of borderline. And then the other ones listed here, travel, meals, transportation, entertainment. These are just not things that are viewed as really like necessary to get the business up and running and can actually weaken your case to include them. Expenses paid to related parties. This is one, let's say that you own a company abroad and, they do website setup. And so you want your US company to pay your company abroad for website setup. This is just not going to be a very strong expense because the officer may look at it and say, well, you haven't put any money at risk. You've just transferred money from one company you own to another company you own. So that's why we would, not advise doing expenses to related parties if at all possible. All right, let's talk about some specific challenges for certain types of businesses, starting with consulting businesses. And we do a lot of consulting businesses. It's very common that people want to start up this type of business. And often what they'll say to us is, I really want to get the E2, but I just don't have anything I can spend money on. There's no possible way I could spend, 40, 50, $60,000. It's impossible because I have my computer, I have my knowledge, that's all I need. And so theoretically, yes, a very low investment is needed, or even no investment possibly to start a consulting business. However, if you want to get the E2 visa, you have to show you have made a substantial investment and that it's substantial enough to convince the officer that you're committed to successfully operating this business. And so there's things that you might not do from an entrepreneurial perspective, but that you need to do for the E2. So a few things that we have strategies here that have kind of worked. So one is you can get kind of industry reports or maybe market research articles that talk about how much it costs to get this type of business up and running. There's kind of Entrepreneur Magazine and kind of others that kind of talk about what are the normal startup expenditures for a consulting business. And then ideally you can include that and show, look, I've spent much more than that. You want to consider spending more money, even though you may not, from an entrepreneurial perspective, you may not do that yet. What we recommend doing is kind of looking forward maybe 1 year, 2 years, and thinking, what would I have spent money on? What would be my operating expenses? I would have paid rent. Maybe I would have, paid for kind of more software services. Maybe I would have gotten an upgraded website in year two. Maybe I would have, hired 3 employees in year two and gotten them computers. And maybe bring some of those expenditures that you're going to make anyway forward and just make those expenditures now. So if you're going to have 3 employees in year two, maybe you purchase the computers for those employees now, even though normally you would wait. And the reason that you do that is that it helps with your investment amount and it's a strong expenditure. It's also a good idea. You want to spend money on a wide range of items. So it's not about kind of saying, look, I spent $40,000 to get a really amazing website, and that's my expenditure. Again, you want to be thinking about, have I spent everything necessary to get this type of business up and running? So things like office space where you prepay for some amount can be helpful. Equipment, kind of investing in maybe hardware, computer, equipment early. Doing a larger investment in marketing. Maybe you can create websites yourself and you plan to have a really bare bones website. A better idea would be to kind of spend a little more, and have a more impressive website because that's also something the consular officers will look at. Hiring employees. So maybe you weren't going to get an employee until year two. It can be helpful sometimes to maybe hire an office assistant, maybe to do some of these setup things that you can't do while you're not in the US. And anything that you pay to that office assistant and anything you pay related to that, insurance, payroll provider, all of those are good expenditures for the E-2. And hiring an employee also shows that you're meeting that marginality requirement. So that can be helpful on two fronts. And as I mentioned, spending over a large number of categories is key. You don't want to have just one large expenditure in one area. It really needs to be kind of a holistic view. Have you spent everything to get this business up and running? All right, let's turn to real estate. So real estate is another kind of high risk area for E2s. If you are going to the consulate and you have kind of a real estate focused company, you want to watch out for some of these challenges we've outlined here. So one challenge is that officers are concerned that real estate is just passive ownership of property. So if you just own some properties, you collect rental income, that's generally not going to be sufficient to get an E2 visa. You need to have a real and operating company that's going to be generating revenue, supporting employees. And so you want to make sure that they're aware that you're not just saying, well, I own some properties. I put my properties in the name of an LLC and I collect income. Um, so you do want to show that, you're running an active business and certain things that have worked in the past for our clients, a real estate brokerage firm, a real estate property management company, generally where you're managing properties other than just your own property. It's kind of better to have a portfolio of companies or of properties that you're managing. If it's all your own, that can work depending on the scale. Real estate, renovation, and construction can work. Also, house flipping, again, on a larger scale. So we had a client who had a portfolio of 30 to 40 homes and was flipping those. However, if you do that type of investment, the total investment amount is going to be much higher because you're purchasing all those properties. If you want to do house flipping, but it's on a much smaller scale, you might consider doing something like having a property management company where house flipping is kind of a secondary service that you offer, and that's something that you can kind of contemplate in your business plan. Another thing to keep in mind for real estate companies is just that it can be a very restricted kind of business. So in certain states, you need to have a broker's license. You need to have certain licenses to do certain types of real estate companies. If you want to have a construction company and you need a general contractor, you want to be thinking about these licensing requirements and figuring out kind of what options do you have. For example, like can you, if you can't get the license that you need yet because you don't have a social security number, can you potentially partner with somebody, local who might be a partner to your business until you can get that license yourself. So you do want to be thinking about these things for real estate cases. All right, equity trading companies, another kind of high risk area, has a lot of similar concerns to real estate. So they are concerned, are you going to be putting your stock portfolio in the name of a company and just doing day trading or just investing personally? These are not things that are generally going to be considered active enough that the company meets the real and operating E-2 requirement. You want to show that you're actually going to go beyond just friends and family and kind of market more broadly and who will be your clients. You have to be able to show you're going to hire US workers. Similar to real estate, it's a highly regulated industry. You need to have proper licenses. If you're doing some kind of like hedge fund arrangement and there's multiple entities, you want to make sure that you've identified which is the E-2 company, where there will be revenue, where there'll be employees, and make sure that the officer understands the structure. We can go to the next slide. Perfect. So let's talk about some reasons for E-2 denials. So one would be, low investment amount. And we have talked today about some strategies, for dealing with low investment amounts, but there are times where the investment is just too low. We had a client who, came to us after applying on their own. They spent $2,000 and had $98,000 in a business bank account. And the officer just did not feel, that just is never going to be enough, even for venues that allow very low investment amounts. 2000 is really just not ever going to be considered substantial enough. So the benefit of being denied based on this is if you do have working capital, it can be relatively easy to fix this type of denial. In this particular case of this client, we advised them on spending. They spent up to 50,000, applied, with 50,000 spent, 50,000 in working capital, and were ultimately approved. The nature of the business can be another reason. So we've just talked about there are some areas like consulting businesses, real estate, equity investment, where there's more risk related to the nature of that business. They may have more questions. Is this really going to be real and operating? Is this a viable business, or is this just passive, real estate ownership? So if you are doing that type of business, you want to just prepare as we discussed. Filing location and venue. So even though the law is the same, consulates will interpret the law differently. And because there is no number that says this is a substantial investment, different consulates over time have trends where some of them will say, well, anything under this amount isn't substantial. And even though it's not supposed to be so specific, sometimes those trends, take hold, and for a few years, a consulate won't grant any E-2s that are, under $350,000 or something like that. So you do want to make sure you're discussing with your attorney about where can I file. Generally, you'll be filing in your country of residence or your country of nationality. Some people can file with U.S. Citizenship and Immigration Services, and this will impact things about your case because the different venues do have different things that they want to see, different, approval rates and submission requirements. So definitely something that's important to discuss with your attorney. Similar, so the next two are kind of related, having a similar business in your home country without employees. The reason why this is a problem is concern over whether the business is going to create jobs for US workers. So if you've been a solo consultant for 10 years, the officer may not believe you when they look at your business plan that says, yes, I'm going to hire someone. So in that type of case, if you have run a similar business without any employees, it can be very helpful to hire an employee before you file, just to kind of proactively address that concern for the officer. Issues with the adjudicating officer. Sorry, can we go back just for yeah, just two more quick ones. Issues with the adjudicating officer. So, officers are human beings. They have different levels of training. They have different, ways that they approach cases. If you really feel like you got an officer who was really off base, didn't understand the law, or that the officer was, their demeanor was, rude or something like that, you would always want to kind of discuss with your attorney. There is very limited recourse for that. If they're really, really off base with the law, there's certain, you can try to file a complaint or kind of get that addressed. But generally, your fastest option is going to be to reapply. And most consulates will try to give you a different officer. So most of the time, if you reapply, you will be getting a different officer. But you will need to be able to explain either change circumstances or, effectively explain why you think, the last decision was wrong. And last, just didn't meet the requirements at the time of filing. So sometimes people will file on their own or with attorneys that are not immigration attorneys. Maybe they file and the treaty country national doesn't control the company, doesn't own 50%. You know, you would not be able to get approved. You would just have to fix, that and reapply. All right, let's talk about some adjudication trends. So government posted approval rates for E2s are between 80 to 90%. Our firm's approval rate is around 98%. Of course, past results do not predict future outcomes. No one can ever guarantee that your visa will be approved. That being said, we do have extensive experience with these types of visas. We could talk about some timelines. So London, right now, they publicly post a timeline of 60 working days. Our experience is it's taking closer to kind of 80 to 90 working days. And then, you'll be called for your interview. Usually can get an interview within a few weeks. In Toronto, there's a recent change here. They do tend to review the files quickly. So, reviewing the files somewhere between 15 to 20 business days and allowing you to schedule your interview. But very recently, people scheduling their interviews, whereas normally they could schedule within maybe 2 to 4 weeks. Now, suddenly the timeline is 3 months. And then generally, timelines will really fluctuate and vary between consulates. I do tell people when you're thinking about an E2 timeline, you want to be thinking in months, not weeks, just because it can take some time, of course, to get the E2 documents together. And then once you submit to the consulate, most of them have a review time of at least a few weeks. And then, appointment availability will vary. Two kind of significant changes recently, uh, you know, which may impact this. One is that interview waivers, the policy really changed and got much more restrictive. Even it used to be that people under 14 or over 79 did not need to attend interviews. Now that waiver is gone and they all have to attend interviews. Similarly, there was a policy change where they were talking about how they are strongly encouraging people, people should be applying in their country of residence or nationality, as opposed to kind of applying as third country nationals somewhere else. Both of these things are likely to have an impact on kind of availability of appointments at consulates. In particular, taking away the interview waiver option means that consulates have to interview more people. And that means there will be, the same number of officers or less officers interviewing, significantly more people. So that means we are expecting to see delays. So if you do want to apply for an E2, keep this timing in mind and apply early. USCIS versus the consulate. So I referenced this a bit earlier. There are some very important differences here, and so we'll go over them. So one is if you are applying with USCIS, you have to be in the United States already in a status that allows you to change your status. So let's say you've entered on ESTA, to do some, research for your business. You cannot apply with USCIS because ESTA does not allow you to change status. Let's say you've entered on a B1, or maybe you're here on an H1B and you want to change your status, then a change of status with USCIS may be available to you. Applying with the USCIS, the benefit is you can stay in the United States. You can pay a fee to get an answer within 15 business days, which can be an approval, denial, or request for evidence. And then if you're approved, you can get a 2-year I-94 that allows you to stay in the United States and work for the business. The downside here is that you will not get a visa stamp in your passport, so you cannot travel internationally. And once you do travel internationally, let's say a year in, you have to go home to your home country, the consulate in your home country that's looking at the case is going to look at it like a brand new case. So they're not going to rely on the approval of USCIS. For people who need to travel frequently, USCIS is often not a good option. Additionally, USCIS takes a very strict view of the source and trail of funds. So if you have a very complex or difficult source and trail of funds, it's often not a good idea to apply with USCIS because they will want a dollar for dollar accounting of exactly where the money came from, how it was maintained over the years, even if it was several years, up till when it was spent on the E2 expenses. Moving to a consulate, the biggest benefit of the consular filing is you're going to get a visa stamp in your passport that allows for international travel. And while there are some countries like Egypt or Bangladesh where you only get a 3-month visa, most countries are getting kind of a multi-year, multi-entry visa. For example, Canada, the UK, you can get a 5-year visa stamp, to travel internationally and to make the business a success. So this is often more attractive to people than a 2-year approval that doesn't allow travel. Another benefit of the consulate is that they don't take usually as granular a look at the source and trail of funds. It's much more kind of big picture. So if you say, well, it's savings from my employment, they may be satisfied with your personal tax returns and proof that you transferred the money. Whereas USCIS would actually want to see every bank statement showing your payroll arriving and being maintained in your bank account up until it was spent. So it can be, if you have a more complex source of funds, a consular filing sometimes can be better because you can take kind of a bigger picture, more holistic view of that. So post-specific considerations, so each post is different, and they each will have kind of their own instructions for how to apply, and sometimes they'll send it back if if it's not in that format. They'll have size file limitations. Some have email submissions. Some require mail submissions still. So each post is different. Just because you've prepared, for example, a case to be filed one place doesn't mean that exact same case can be filed somewhere else. It would likely need to be updated based on the consular preferences. Um, Also, some consulates are requiring that a CPA certify your business plan. So, generally for a startup, you have to provide a business plan with 5 years of financials and hiring plan. And other information. And, some consulates, Mexico comes to mind, where they do want a certification by a CPA. At Scout Legal, we do actually have a CPA. And so this is something that we can offer in addition to kind of drafting the business plan. But it is something you want to keep in mind. For example, if you are hiring someone to do your business plan or you're drafting it yourself, you will need to get that CPA certification for certain consulates. All right, let's look at some issues in complex areas for E2. So a very common question, do I have to hire employees before I apply for the E2 visa? And the answer is no, it's not a requirement. The regulation says, especially if it's a startup, needs to show that it's going to be able to make the significant economic contribution and support more than just the investor and their family within a 5-year period. That being said, there are some consulates, largely ones that are more used to seeing large multinational companies who are sending over lots of E2 employees. They may, not be as happy with a kind of small investor case where nobody has been hired. So it's not a requirement, but it's always stronger for your case if you can hire employees. Um, Complicated source and trail of funds. So, as I just discussed for USCIS, they really want to see a dollar for dollar accounting of exactly where the money came from. Even if you got the money, a long time ago, they will ask for the entire trail. So that is something to keep in mind. It's always a good idea to discuss with your attorney before you get the financing in place or transfer any money, just to make sure that there is that clear trail, especially for USCIS, but also for consulates. Um, People will ask, can I have a loan? Can I have a gift? Um, yes. So for a gift, you can have a gift, but you will have to show where the gift giver got their money. So getting a gift isn't a way to kind of avoid the source of funds requirement. The gift giver will have to feel comfortable sharing their financial information. For loans, you can have personal loans that are secured by your assets. So let's say you take out like a home equity loan or second mortgage on your home. That's fine. An unsecured loan is also fine. What you can't do is have a loan secured by the assets of the E2 company. And where this comes up a lot is seller financing. So if you're purchasing a business and you're putting down like a 50% deposit and the rest of it is seller financing secured by the assets of the company, that's not going to work well for an E2. They're not going to consider that seller financing portion as part of your investment and would likely find you had not invested a substantial amount if you only spent 50% of the purchase price. Um, E2s for two investors. This is possible, but it has to be 50-50. Substantive changes to the E2 business after filing. Sometimes people have it in their head, I have a 5-year visa, I can work in the US. And it's not that expansive. The E2 visa that allows you to work for the company that you presented to the consulate as long as you continue to meet those E2 requirements. So if there's a change in ownership and suddenly, you don't own 50% of the business anymore and you don't control it anymore, this is going to be a problem for the E2. Even if you have a 5-year visa, if 2 years in you lose control of the company, your visa is no longer valid and you shouldn't remain in the United States and work on it. Changes in the type of business. So let's say you had a wedding photography business. Now you want to close it down and start a restaurant. You can't do that without first getting an approval. The You're allowed to run the type of business that you presented, to the consulate. However, what you can do is try to plan ahead. So if you say to yourself, "Hey, I want to have I really want to do a mobile app, but right now in the short term, I'm going to offer software consulting services," then in your business plan, you can explain in year 3, we're going to start mobile app development. And this can be a way that you don't have to go back and get kind of another approval before, adding a new service line. Um, Family business purchases. So if you are purchasing from a family member, they will kind of look at your case, um, more closely. They will wonder, is this really the fair market value of the business? They're going to look at the financials. They're going to look at the purchase price. These things should make sense. If it's a really profitable business with a ton of assets and the purchase price is really low, and it's your brother, that's not going to look good to an officer. You do want to make sure that you either have a valuation explaining how you came to that amount. Maybe a CPA has written a letter, or just that from a common sense perspective, it makes sense if you look at the financials. Um, let's talk about the impact of the current administration. So lots of executive orders have come out about immigration. None kind of directly touching on the E-2, although the one on kind of enhanced vetting of all visa applications obviously has an impact in that all applications are being scrutinized more closely. Changes we're seeing or kind of expect to see, higher investment amounts are going to be more favorable, higher employee numbers, in particular, hiring US workers. This is something they asked about last time and likely will ask about more this time as well. Um, Also investments, in the United States. So you can invest anywhere as long as you've invested a substantial amount, put the funds at risk. That being said, the purpose of the E-2 visa is to facilitate an economic benefit, between the countries and to the United States. So if you can show that you have spent money in the United States, that's going to be more favorable. Approval rates did not change much from 2016 to 2020 in terms of E2s. That's not to say they couldn't change this time, but so far we have not seen, any major changes to the E2 visa program, and it does tend to be a favorable program under, any administration because it does drive investment into the United States and, hiring as well. All right, let's
Okay,
see.
thank you, Kelly. That was really helpful and very informative. And let's go ahead and take a look at the questions.
Perfect. Great. Someone has asked where we are located. Our firm is located in New York, but as immigration is federal law, we help clients kind of all over the country and the world with U.S. immigration needs. Um, all right. Can you speak to seller financing when buying a business? What is the max you can seller financing? So I think seller financing is generally not good for an E2. We don't recommend using seller financing if you're doing an E2. You would want to get another source of financing. Um, what do you think should be the minimum investment on residential assisted living? So I kind of can't, if you have specific questions about a type of business or a case, I would strongly encourage you to set up a consultation with us so we can go through it. We can't kind of just provide numbers. It would not be helpful or meaningful. It's going to, again, depend on have you spent everything necessary to get that business up and running. So a residential living facility, probably going to have a lot of expenditures, right? You need a space. That space needs to be outfitted. You need licenses. So all these are the things you would want to spend money on. In terms of our fees, please feel free to reach out to us, and we're happy to send you our engagement letter that goes over all our fees and services. Um, what does status B1 and B2 mean? B1 is a business visitor status. B2 is a tourism status. If you get a B1 or B2 visa stamp in your passport, you can enter the United States, on B1 or B2. And lastly, someone said this was a great presentation. Thank you so much. We really enjoyed, speaking with you today. Um, it appears we have gotten through all the questions, so we will close here. Thank you very much.
Okay, thank you.